Today we'll look into how you can get the maximum out of your opponents, not by playing like the solver or trying to do so, but how to actually adjust against your opponent and their tendencies. So this is a hand on high stakes. This is just an example, and we're gonna apply our learnings to mid stakes and below, because that's where most people play at. And this hand is just an example of a hand. Of course, these players are very individual players, as are most players. Basically, every player is an individual. However, on mid stakes and below, we don't always know their exact tendencies, just because player pools are so big, and we sometimes have to rely on overall population tendencies. And that's what we are gonna look at today after looking at the hand. So here, Ignacio Nacho 3-bets the small blind against Munoz Star. He calls 6-5. I think this is a can but not a must pre-flop. Flops a pair and a backdoor flush draw. C-bet is probably the standard play here. Munoz calls. Then on the turn, we have two options, check or barrel. And we'll look into what is the better option according to the solver. And then later also what might be the better play against population at lower stakes. Here, Nacho chooses to check. Munoz Star checks behind. And then the river is a jack. We have a pair. We might just be good at showdown, so we could hope to win against some king queen, king jack, not king jack, king 10, queen 10 maybe that floated the flop. Some other backdoor flush draws will be in the buttons range as well, because the flop c-bet was, I think, just 20%. So Munoz Star isn't allowed to fold a lot of hands on the flop. So Nacho just checks. No point in turning your hand into a bluff here or anything. Then Munoz starts to bet, and Ignacio decides to make the call. We're going to look into what happens here at a later point. Now we want to move forward unbiased as always and have a quick look into what the solver would do here. So let me move this hand over here, look into what happened. Button opens, small blind 3-bets. So here, yes, 6-5 is mixing as I assumed. Then button calls 35%, 4-bets 10%. We call, or the button calls. And then on the flop, we have it's around 20%. A 20% c-bet. Let's just give him only that, because we assume he only chooses that sizing. Then for button, we can just go with the automatic, because that line doesn't occur here. 1 second, let me see. Pot is around 22 and a half. 22 and a half, I think. 23. Shouldn't do public math. All right, for the stacks, I will just go with the safe route and calculate it. All right, so 95 big blinds are in play here effectively. Then we get the c-bet. On the turn, we'll have a look at what would be the best size if we only used one for the small blind, and the same for the button. They both check, so this doesn't happen. So for the river, we can also go with the automatic one. Just have a look at what would be the best size here to use according to GTO Wizard. And then for the button on the river, let's go with 50, 75, and then let's give him an overbet as well. Or maybe turn this into a pot size, so we have a little wider distribution. And then we can start. Deuce. Right, so we pretty much see a range bet here. Don't think that actually range betting would decrease the EV a lot, but let's have a look. Just to make sure. Range bet, lock it. So range betting is better than the absolute equilibrium strategy here, which might just be an inaccuracy. So this shouldn't happen, of course. If the solver can do whatever it wants, choose the frequencies completely freely, then the EV shouldn't be lower than when we lock the simulation and don't give it any options to choose from. So this is likely just an inaccuracy, but we can assume that the EV won't be lower if we just range bet here. So let's just go with this one. Assume they range bet here for 20%. And then the button would fold only 10% of hands. So as I assumed previously, a lot of backdoor flush draws are in here. So even hands like Queen 9 of clubs and diamonds would continue. Jack 8 as well, 10-7 as well. So pretty much no backdoor flush draw folds purely, it looks like. Some of them mix folds, but yeah, the only pure combos that fold are these King 10 and Jack 10 off combos, and then the hard combos that do not have a backdoor straight draw, pretty much. Or a very bad one, like 10-7. All right, so pretty wide range that the button continues here. And then on the deuce, we see that 80%, so a rather big bet size would be the best one if we only used one. 6-7 would basically always check here. Yeah, not really a betting strategy that is implemented here. So that's quite cool that he got this right. Then button would only bet 23.5% here as well. What would be the hands? Top pair and better, and only the best ones. So ace 10 and better. Ace 6 is 2 pair. Full house 6 is always bet. Quads check behind and slow play. And then kings and worse would be hands that could be bluffing here. So kings, only the flush draw ones, basically. And then king jack of hearts as well. So hearts and diamonds are pretty preferred here. Diamonds because they have a flush draw, of course, and then hearts because when we have hearts, we unblock our opponent's backdoor flush draws. So as we saw, no, we bet range here. So why do they bet more often with the hearts? Might be a little more complicated than I want to go into right now. So let's continue on with queen high and worse. Here, queen jack always bets, probably blocking a lot of ace queen and ace jack. Queen 10 similar. And then here with the lower ones, we see a slight or even bigger preference for flush draws as well. 4-5 always betting with the gut shot, and yeah, 5 high. So not too much to lose if we get check jammed on. When the river is a jack, then we can start betting again. 40% is a preferred size here, which allows us to bet a little bit thinner. So queens could always bet for value here. Most top pairs as well. Said under pairs, second pairs as well. So pretty much every jack X could bet here and expect to get called by worse a decent amount of the time. even some third pairs, probably, yeah, very thin value bets, but also preventing our opponent from bluffing us off our hand. King high could turn into bluffs sometimes, and then everything that is queen high and worse always wants to go for the bluff here. So the hands that don't want to bet here or are the most checked ones are these third pairs and lower, and 6-5 is one of those. It seems like this is actually the hand or one of the hands that bets the very least often. And against a bet, which would happen for 50% most of the time, some pot size bets as well, against 50%. 6-5 would be just a pure call, so pretty standard here. Which means Nacho played this hand pretty much exactly GTO, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And at least at these stakes, that is probably a good reason to play it this way. However, now let's have a look at what would be, or what might be a better play at lower stakes, because at low stakes and mid stakes even, we cannot really assume our opponent plays close to GTO at all. And that means that we also could implement a strategy that is better than GTO as well, because it exploits their deviation from GTO. So let's not deviate too much on the flop. Here, range betting is probably always going to be a good option, but let me double check on that. Here, on the right screen, on the other one, which you cannot see at the moment, I have my Excel sheet, which is included in GTO to exploit. And here we can see how population plays in every line. So I will just screenshot it because I cannot give everything for free out here for free in the free video. If you're interested, check out GTO to exploit. But on ace high flops, we see that population, that is this this value right here, 36, overfolds. So they fold more often than GTO, which would be 30. They fold the solver, so GTO would fold 30% of the time on ace high flops. However, population folds 36% of the time, so we already see an overfold, which does incentivize us to bet a lot more often if we want to play somewhat balanced. We could, of course, implement also an extremely unbalanced strategy, because if we know our opponent overfolds, then we don't have that big of an incentive to bet our value hands, right? Because our value hands profit from getting caught. And if we know our opponent overfolds, then we could exploit that by not betting as often with our value hands. However, that leads us into a little bit of a sticky situation, which is that if we then start to always check our value hands and always bet our bluffs, we could become extremely unbalanced and very vulnerable to re-exploitation, which, if your opponent is somewhat aware at least, or you play them often enough, can lead to you losing more often, or losing much more than you being the one who exploits your opponent. So the safe approach, or the safe exploit in this spot, is to simply bet more often with your entire range, and that would mean range betting is gonna be a little bit more profitable even in practice than in theory if our opponents overfold here. But now let's go ahead to the turn and see what happens here. On a deuce, a deuce is a rather blankish card. However, of course, I cannot. A little bit confused right now. Let's have a look at what population does on the turn. So if we bet here, we can again assume that our opponent overfolds. So this is the turn node after calling the flop c-bet on an ace. They will again overfold here against the bet because they fold 40% of the time, while GTO, so GTO bots would fold only 35% of the time. And in this one, for this node, we also have an article in the program, GTO to exploit program. And let's have a quick look here. Population overfolds against the turn barrel. And what I do here is I simulate a GTO reaction from the button, then a slightly deviated reaction against the barrel, which accounts for whatever population is doing according to data. So here they overfold. So I adjusted the calling range a little bit to have them overfold here. And then at the end, we will see what we could do differently. This would be our GTO barrel. And of course, we cannot make a simulation for every single board here. But on this board, ace 6, 3, 9, we have a board that is at least not too different from ace 6, deuce, deuce. And here what we'll see is that in GTO, everything that is an underpair, second pair, third pair will mostly check here on the turn. However, if we expect our opponent to overfold, then third pairs and a few second pairs can also start betting or barreling rather. And third pair is, in this example, 6x. So we see in GTO, 6-5, for example, will always check or almost always check. But if we expect our opponent to overfold, then 6-5 could start barreling almost always here. Of course, 6-5 is a little bit of a different hand on this board than on this board, but it's not too different either. And this should just help you estimate which kinds of hands want to deviate in their action. So here we can see, for example, that underpairs still never bet, even as an exploit when our opponent overfolds. But the kinds of hands that want to start barreling more often are these third pairs, king highs, and even worse hands, so queen high and worse. And on this board, 6-5 would be one of those hands in those categories. So as a result, what does that mean? Against population, you would also not make a big mistake, or maybe even make a little bit more profit if you barreled this and profited from your opponent folding hands like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s. Also letting go of equity like king queen, king jack, king 10, and making a little bit more profit by having them fold hands that they shouldn't. And now let's go to the river. So when we check, the button checks as well, and we then face a bet. Let's go to this node. So whenever it goes check, check on the turn, we check the river and we face a bet by population. Let's have a look at what population does in that node. And I'll screenshot it again. One second. Whoops, that was not it. So here we see that in the call flop, check turn, and then bet the river line, population actually plays quite close in terms of frequency to GTO. So GTO would bet 45% of the time in that node, and population does bet 44% of the time. So that is okay. That doesn't differ that much from GTO. However, here we also have an article which I'm going to click on to see a little bit more details. And here what we'll see in the first sentence is that population bets similarly often. We just saw that, but they are more value heavy because they bet value hands more often and they bluff less often. So frequency wise, they are close to GTO. However, from a range composition perspective, they actually differ from GTO. And if they value bet more often and bluff less often, that of course has an effect on what we can do. So let's just scroll down here to some of the GTO solutions, or for some of the strategies that we can play. According to GTO, against the check, we should then play this strategy. Sorry. No, this is our reaction against the button's GTO bet. So according to GTO, if we expect our opponent on the button to bet a GTO strategy, then we can go ahead and play this strategy here. So we could call every top pair. We could check raise every two pair. We could check raise every set. We could even check call most second pairs. We would have to fold most under pairs. And then everything that is third pair or lower would have to fold basically always. And again, this is a little bit of a different board than this one right here. However, it's not that different as well either. So, right? However, we see that one of the differences is that third pairs and lower always fold here. When here against the bet, we saw that third pair can at least call half the time. That has to do with the fact that the deuce paired here, so it's less pairs possible, less two pair are possible, less sets are possible. So the composition for both players changes a little bit, but still we want to focus on how what kind of deviation we can make. So here again, basically second pairs and top pairs and better can call almost always. Let's simplify it a little bit. However, when we expect our opponent to value bet a little bit more often, even just, and bluff a little bit less often, which I explained in more detail, and I showed the ranges above here, but let's not focus on that for the moment. Then we can see that everything that is worse than top pair quickly becomes a pure fold, just as a reaction and as an exploit against the too value heavy bet by our opponent. And that would mean that even if 6-5 would be a call here in GTO, it's very likely that in this case we would have the same thing happening, which is that everything that is lower than top pair quickly becomes a fold if we have an opponent who doesn't bluff as often as GTO would and even value bets a little bit more often. So even though this is a very GTO approved call or line in general, if you face this action or you find yourself in this line on mid stakes or even low stakes, it's much more likely that just folding the river against the bet is a better play for you. And by doing that, you exploit population, you win more money because you simply don't pay off their very un-GTO river bet. Here, let's see what happens. Munistar bets, as we saw, Nacho calls, and Munistar was indeed bluffing here with pocket fours. And that is something that you will not see as often on lower stakes. People turning their low pairs into bluffs on the river. I can very well see an opponent betting king 10 here, or maybe even king queen. Or if they are very aggressive, then they might even start betting a hand like this on the turn and trying to bluff us off. But just checking the turn and then turning it into a bluff on the river is a little bit rare. It's a little bit more rare. So I think going for an exploit and just overfolding the river here is gonna be very effective in practice. So if you want more of these, I have an article coming out every day in GTO to exploit. Have a look at it if you want to. If not, then just watch the free stuff coming out much more as well. And we will also have a new video on the main channel as well, which is going to be about a similar spot, blind versus in position in a 3-bet pot. So look out for that, and I'm happy to see you over there. See ya.